When my family lived in Cambodia, one of our favorite places to visit was the Phnom Tamao Zoological Park and Wildlife Rescue Center. And although people sometimes called it the zoo, its mission focuses on addressing illegal hunting and wildlife trade in Southeast Asia. Phnom Tamao is something more like a hospital or a rehabilitation center. It cares for injured, orphaned, or ill wild animals that were often rescued from wildlife trafficking. As you might guess, many of these animals are critically endangered or endangered and vulnerable species. Animals that can be fully rehabilitated are released back into their natural habitat. And the statistics that I had available to me between 2013 and 2018, more than 8,000 animals had been released from Phnom Tamao back into the wild. But those who are no longer able to survive in the wild and need continued care remain at the rescue center. And they make income for the park by allowing visitors to come in and view them. We had the good luck to know one of the folks who coordinated the Free the Bears program there in Cambodia, a program that not only works to rescue and care for endangered sun bears, but also works to transform cultural attitudes about them, giving the bears and their ecosystems the best chance they have to thrive. As excited as I get about the Phnom Tamao Zoological Park, this reflection isn't about that place or the work that they do. Work that was, I have to mention, put at risk last year by the deforestation and planned development around the rescue center that was halted only after public outcry. But I mention it because it was during one of our visits to the rescue center when I had an experience that I will never forget. Looking for a break from the sunshine and the heat, we wandered into a small gift shop. And the woman working inside struck up a conversation and was delighted that we were somewhat conversational in Khmer. The conversation quickly shifted away from caring for animals, though, when she asked what we were doing in Cambodia. And we described briefly the peace work that we were there doing, helping develop domestic violence programming to reduce and heal family conflict and violence, offering mediation, conflict coaching, and other peace-building services to English speakers, and supporting the human rights community and community development workers on how to integrate peace and conflicts tools into their organizations and activities. And she was excited about it. And she kept asking more and more questions to the point that she was suddenly hugging us with tears streaming down her face. And we talked for quite a while after that. In my memory, it's a couple of hours that we sat listening to her, hearing her stories of surviving the Khmer Rouge, then the Civil War, and then the years of often violent chaos as Cambodia began to recover from decades of both systemic and random violence. She described how violence had become just a part of life, a way to survive, a habit, an automatic way of living for so many people. And it was, for me in that conversation, a powerful reminder of how quickly and easily and thoroughly violence can become part of us. It may begin as a possibility. We talk to ourselves about it being a last resort. From a possibility, it moves into an exception, something that you didn't maybe even mean to do. We felt necessity required you to do. Until then, it becomes a habit, and then it becomes a culture. That possibility, that capacity for violence exists within all of us, and we must deal honestly with that potential if we don't want to be ruled by it. And that can be difficult. But the flip side of that potential is that healing and compassion can also become part of us. Healing, compassion, and joy remain a possibility, part of the human capacity, even in the most desperate situations. And when we act on that possibility, the choice may be exceptional at first, but choosing it again and again and again, it becomes a habit. And when chosen with others, chosen together as a community, it can become a culture. These experiences and lessons were very fresh in my mind when, near the end of our time in Cambodia in 2010, a study by researchers at the University of Valencia investigated which brain structures were at work during experiences both of empathy and then of violence. And they found that the neural pathways associated with empathy had a substantial overlap in a surprising way with those pathways that regulate aggression and violence. And the lead author of that study, Dr. Louise Moya Albiol, explained, "We all know that encouraging empathy has an inhibiting effect on violence, but this may not only be a social question, but also a biological one. Stimulation of these neuronal circuits in one direction reduces their activity in the other. Educating people to be empathetic," he said, "could be an education for peace, bringing about a reduction in conflict and belligerent acts." And that immediately made sense to me, at least from my experience with both meditation practices such as mindfulness and metta meditation, and empathetic practices like transformative mediation and nonviolent communication. I have found myself encountering the scared, the angry, and the aggressive aspects within myself, and then watching as they settle down, released in that embrace of compassionate awareness. But the study said something more than this, potentially helping us answer that nagging question: how can we humans be so wonderful and so horrible at the same time? So generous and compassionate on the one hand, and so cruel and violent on the other. It could even be that the possibility of violence is part of the price we pay for the beautiful opportunity to connect with each other with compassion, care, empathy, and respect, because they share those similar circuits in the brain. A further example comes from a 2016 comprehensive review of the neurobiology of empathy in comparison with the neurobiology of psychopathic predatory violence. This was a study by Doriana Chialant, Judith Edersheim, and Bruce Price. And although we typically think of violence in connection with self-defense and self-preservation, and we will willing to act violently as a way to protect ourselves, we're less inclined to think of empathy as a type of self-protection. But the authors point out that our capacity for empathy evolved in the service of attachment for self-preservation. If you think about the most foundational of mammalian social bonds, that of parent and infant, it makes sense. Empathy and a healthy bond are the most important protections for a newborn against predators and other dangers. And these same capacities, they support all our social relationships. Empathy and healthy social bonds reduce personal distress and reduce avoidance behaviors. Healthy attachment supports healthy emotional regulation, which in turn supports our ability to experience and express empathy for others. At the chemical level, the authors point out that oxytocin is released into the context of supportive relationships. This is part of our brain's reward systems. For example, hormonal shifts during pregnancy, quote, predispose the brain reward system to form mother-infant bonds at birth, end quote. And interactions between a securely attached mother and a child, quote, increase the production of oxytocin, activating the brain reward regions. This modulates the brain, enabling greater trust, attachment, and empathy. They also noted, quote, both secure attachment and higher degrees of empathic capacity hormonally activate the brain reward system, which in turn sustains attachment and nurturance. In other words, it feels good. You get a surge of the chemicals that bring pleasure to you when you form those healthy social bonds. They wrote, because empathy and attachment are linked to the same hormonal events, they are both behaviorally and physiologically interdependent. Even when empathic behaviors are extended to non-kin, to people you're not related to, these behaviors activate the reward system, inducing feelings of well-being. Thus, empathic behaviors are physiologically rewarding, if not addictive. It's good for us. We evolved for it to feel good for us. And the reverse is also true. The literature demonstrates that violent traits and even psychopathic behaviors, including predatory and callous unemotional violence, are tightly linked to the same structures activated during empathic processing. A functional imbalance of those pathways leads, in the author's words, to the cognitive and interpersonal affective aspects of psychopathy. In other words, when those things get out of balance, that lack of empathy, that lack of social bonding is what facilitates psychopathic behavior and causes so much of the violence in our society. However, and really hopefully, a corollary of this, the authors wrote, is that strengthening empathy, which enhances bonding, might result in diminished predatory violence. Our understanding of the human brain continues to deepen, and this topic is still one where we have a lot to learn. However, research like this points to something very hopeful, namely cultivating empathy and compassion, which are wonderful practices for so many reasons, may also help heal and protect us, though not make us immune from the potential for violence that has devastated so much of human history. It's another piece of evidence that may help us understand what practices and values, be they direct, structural, or cultural, support a peaceful, just, and happy place to live. This is not an absolute decision. Humans and human society are more complicated than that. But it is a question about the overall shape of our lives, the overall shape of our society. Will they be characterized by violence, relying on our capacities for coercion and aggression? Or will they be characterized by healthy social bonds, relying on our capacities for wisdom and compassion? What's going to be exceptional? What will we accept as exceptional? Will it be violence or empathy? Which will we accept as normal, violence or empathy? We can understand both paths as strategies to protect ourselves and recognize that both possibilities live within us. But the research also points out that these are diverging paths. We nourish one path at the expense of the other. As Dr. Albiol put it, stimulation of these neuronal circuits in one direction reduces the activity in the other direction. Each decision we make is something of a crossroads. Collectively and personally, our decisions are answering the question, whether we mean to or not, of which direction do we choose. As I've noted in the past, I'm asked from time to time about why I've embraced the path of cultivating wisdom and compassion. Perhaps unsurprisingly, in a society so often oriented around violence and coercion, the greatest anxiety is, will wisdom and compassion work? Will it get me what I want to get? And I've been told with some frequency about how naive I am to embrace wisdom and compassion, and how in doing so, I'm endangering the whole planet. Most of these conversations come out of a moral view of violence, which rather pushes us into conversations about when violence is justified. But this can very easily camouflage the issue that violence always includes suffering. There's no way to be violent that doesn't cause suffering for others, and usually even to ourselves. So you can study in the case of perpetration-induced trauma. It causes suffering to the victor and the victim, to the perpetrator, to the bystander, and to the earth itself. Another one of my memorable conversations in Cambodia came about when a very sincere man was struggling with these kinds of questions. He was just visiting Cambodia, trying to get an idea of the human rights programming that was going on there. It was part of a cultural exchange, and learning about those types of peace and development work put him face to face with Cambodia's very brutal past. Horrible memories of still open wounds, many of the same tragedies that our new friend had talked about at the Wildlife Rescue Center. So he had grieved the cruelty and the brutality and the death within the walls of Tuol Sleng, or S-21, the Khmer Rouge's torture machine, and he had wept over the Tower of Skulls, memorializing the killing fields. Then he had listened to desperate stories of people facing violent eviction and land grabbing, suffering violence in that moment in real time. He was overwhelmed and confused and found himself asking, How can someone choose compassion and wisdom in the face of something like the Khmer Rouge? Won't they inevitably fail? But if we visit these terrible places, the killing fields of Cambodia, or the gas chambers of Germany, or the mass graves of any one of the 20th century's genocides, we need to remember what it is that we're actually witnessing. These are not testaments to the inherent weaknesses of wisdom and compassion, though they might be testaments to our collective failure to cultivate wisdom and compassion. Instead, these places are monuments of violence, of the horrors humans are capable of inflicting and suffering when they do not learn the art of living with wisdom, compassion, joy, and equanimity. We could similarly look at the ongoing violence endemic to our own society and see how it reflects the ultimate failure of violence as a long-term strategy for creating collective and personal well-being. We're not going to get there with more and more violence piling up on itself. Arguments about when violence is necessary or justified or unavoidable can distract us from the real issue at hand, and that issue is that it is unwise to wait to remove greed, hatred, and delusion from our lives until circumstances are at their worst. We shouldn't wait to cultivate empathy and healthy social bonds until we're facing a war or a great injustice. This practice is for every single day. It's about how you think about yourself, how you treat your children or your colleagues at work, even how you express disappointment or respond to criticism. All violence is a form of suffering, and we cannot wait for a crisis to begin the transformation. It really is like Thich Nhat Hanh said, when you have peace within yourself, you can bring peace to another person. When you both have peace, you can bring it to a third person. This is the only way. It's challenging to bring up this point of view without oversimplifying things. Cultivating authentic wisdom and compassion cannot be a retreat into unrealistic idealism. It's not pretending that pain and difficulty are never a part of our experience. It's not about coercing ourselves, resisting the present moment in favor of forcing positive or pleasant emotions onto ourselves or others. Instead, it's about being able to accept and engage with that pain and difficulty with curiosity, openness, and love. Oh, this is what it feels like when there is conflict, violence, suffering. This is what it feels like when there is anger, fear, and grief. This is what it feels like when there is greed, hatred, delusion. The practice is to hold both the potential for violence together with the potential for wisdom and compassion. We've known for decades now, for example, that witnessing violence impacts the neurological development of children. Published in 1997, Bruce Perry's Incubated in Terror, Neurodevelopmental Factors in the Cycle of Violence, remains a powerful exploration of how childhood experiences may condition us for life in a violent world. It changes the way our brains develop to help us survive what we now know is a violent place to live. And a lot of those mechanisms prime us for also acting violently. He also highlights factors for breaking that cycle of violence, for being able to heal those wounds and prevent them from happening. He wrote, "It is in the nature of humankind to be violent, but it may not be the nature of humankind. Without major transformation of our culture, without putting action behind our love of children," he said, "we may never learn the truth." So how do we get there? How do we put into action our love for children, for one another, and even and especially our love for the other, for the enemy? One tool at our disposal is the Buddhist practice of metta, or loving kindness meditation, which I'm hoping to describe more fully next month. But very briefly, it's a simple technique for cultivating kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity for oneself and for others. And one of the foundational studies on this practice is detailed in an article, a study called Open Hearts Build Lives, Positive Emotions Induced Through Loving Kindness Meditation. A research team led by Barbara Fredrickson described the empirically supported broaden and build theory. That holds that positive emotions broaden people's attention and thinking by training the mind, first, to widen the scope of people's visual attention, second, to broaden their repertoires of desired actions, and third, to increase their openness to new experiences. And that broadening increases our sense of oneness with others. It increases our trust that we have, even in acquaintances. And it strengthens and builds our ability to recognize people, even people who we might think are different from us. And the second part of the theory is that we can build consequential personal resources. The authors called this a growth trajectory, where cultivating positive emotions led to growth over time in our capacity for optimism, tranquility, the ability to adapt to change, our mental well-being, and our healthy relationships. That broadening and building has obvious overlaps with and impacts our capacity to choose empathy and to intentionally cultivate wisdom and compassion over the shortcuts of violence and coercion. It helps us notice possibilities that we would otherwise overlook and to be open to strategies that we would otherwise be too inflexible to consider. It helps us understand how we are all connected and recognize the potential to know and to trust those who we might otherwise think are too different or maybe even too dangerous. It keeps us adaptable, even when circumstances might be screaming for us to dig in and make demands. And it helps keep that path open when otherwise we might not see any other option but hate. In the 9-week study conducted by Fredrickson's team, they found that loving kindness meditation increased participants' daily experiences of love, joy, gratitude, contentment, hope, pride, interest, amusement, and awe. That's a pretty good list. Those are kind of things that you would like to have your day filled more and more with. They were slow and small changes, spread out incrementally over the 9-week study. And they were linked with real increases in intra and interpersonal skills, such as mindful attention and self-acceptance. Their satisfaction in life increased, their depression decreased. These were long-term gains that made a big difference, a real difference in people's lives. Significantly, those impacts were not really direct effects, though. Instead, they came because participants were building resources, in the author's words, that make their lives more fulfilling. They concluded that people judge their lives to be more satisfying and fulfilling, not because they feel more positive emotions per se, but because their greater positive emotions help them build resources for living successfully. That makes sense. When you feel good, you have more confidence, more energy, and more time to give to the things that you really want to do, to build those skills that make life better. You're not diverting that energy and time and attention into those hypervigilant activities that are required of us when we're going down a pathway of violence. Building those resources is key because we are then on a path to make well-being in ourselves and in community available to all of us. And that takes moving away from a culture where fear, anger, greed, scarcity, and ignorance is normal. It takes choosing a path where wisdom and compassion are normal, so that we're building resources personally and collectively where we can thrive. As the Buddhist monk and scholar Nyanaponika Thera wrote, "The world suffers, but most people have their eyes and ears closed. They do not see the unbroken stream of tears flowing through life. They do not hear the cry of distress continually pervading the world. Their own grief or joy bars their sight, deafens their ears. Bound by selfishness, their hearts turn stiff and narrow. Being stiff and narrow, how should they be able to strive for any higher goal, to realize that only release from selfish craving will affect their own freedom from suffering? It is compassion that removes the heavy bar, opens the door to freedom, makes the narrow heart as wide as the world." Thank you for being part of a community and movement that seeks to make that kind of transformation real, taking our narrow hearts and opening them as wide as the world. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.